If you want thorough world building, you need look no further than The Lord of the Rings. As you probably know, JRR Tolkien's classic book, yes, it was originally one massive book, has more information, historical dates, ancestral trees, and overall complexity than any piece of fiction ever has or probably ever will. Tolkien was an extremely educated author. By the end of his life, he was fluent or partially fluent in Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, German, Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, Welsh, Finnish, and Elvish.
I first began seriously to invent languages about when I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really. Languages have a flavor to me, which I never understand people saying, for instance, it was awfully dry and dull, because a new language to me is just like taking a new wine or a new sweetmeat or something.
Aside from his language studies, Tolkien's work on The Lord of the Rings was endlessly influential on the fantasy genre as a whole. Many common fantasy tropes we see today were invented, or at least popularized, by his books. The idea of a life force tied to a magical object, massive battles with many types of fantastical creatures, and heck, a diverse team of noble heroes are all common ideas because of The Lord of the Rings. Most of all, though, Tolkien's work set the standard for world building in fantasy. I would argue that if it weren't for The Lord of the Rings, we might not have the vast universes and mythologies like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World that we know today. Tolkien really generated the idea of a living, breathing fantasy world with many stories to be told. When I sat down to write this essay, I wanted to ask what may be the most obvious but least explored question about Tolkien's life that I think many, including myself, have wanted the answer to. That question is, what drove him to write such an in-depth, complicated, blooming mythos for a world that he made up? Tolkien was a husband, a father, and a college professor, and before that, a soldier. Much of the framework for LOTR was written in the trenches. He was a busy man. Writing Middle-earth's mythology was stacked on top of his daily life. He often stayed up writing into the late hours of the night because he didn't have time during the day. This world, this fictional world, had to be very important to him. So what drove him to take on this massive project that took years to finish? First, you have to consider the fact that Tolkien was a man who loved history and the legends that inhabited it. As a young man, he absorbed himself in the glorious historical legends of wonder and magic, constantly formulating opinions on them and eventually starting to write critiques. One of the biggest pre-Lord of the Rings events in his career was a paper he wrote about Beowulf and how it had been misunderstood by the people that analyzed it. Consequently, Beowulf is now required reading in high school because of that paper. Things like this showed his extreme passion for the legends and tales of Middle England. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit before it was perhaps his attempt to try to see if he could capture that magic by writing some himself. One thing about The Lord of the Rings that many people don't seem to know is that, in a sense, it is a revisionist history book. Tolkien's passion for folklore was strong with anglo-saxon stories like Beowulf, but that didn't extend to things like King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot. This was because the stories of Arthur's Round Table, contrary to popular belief, weren't completely British in origin. Those stories were actually a compilation of many cultures, clattering together to create one folktale in a way that Tolkien may have seen as disjointed. Tolkien liked things pure. He liked his British mythology uncontaminated by the outside world. In his essay Tolkien's Time Machine, When Literary Worlds Collide, Michael Martinez says, "The Lord of the Rings may be Tolkien's attempt to define the modern English heroic romance as it might have evolved from the uninterrupted Anglo-Saxon literary tradition. Anglo-Saxon authors would have been introduced and reintroduced to the classics as the centuries unfolded. As Tolkien devised alternative plural forms for words such as dwarf, dweros, and dwarves instead of the traditional dwarfs, so he may have sought to devise an alternate model for English literature. The Lord of the Rings is set in an imaginary time in our past." Essentially what Martinez is saying here is that Middle-earth is an imagining of the Anglo-Saxon mythology as it would have been if King Arthur had not come along. Tolkien's passion for history is clear here. When he wrote The Lord of the Rings, it wasn't about providing a sequel to The Hobbit, as he said originally. Instead, it was about giving an entire historical culture a better mythology, a purer mythology. Many comparisons can be made with the riders of Rohan and Gondor and the Danes and Geats from Beowulf. Gollum is often likened to a slightly more empathetic rendition of the monster Grendel. And of course, The Hobbit and Beowulf both feature a dragon guarding a hoard of gold, awakened by a thief. The stories aren't set in the same universe, to use a modern term, but they're set in the same style, the same cultural tone. In many ways, Lord of the Rings was Tolkien's big, long, romantic love letter to the Anglo-Saxon myth. To him, this wasn't just another fictional children's book. This was a glorification of something very real and dear to him. So, what made Tolkien write The Lord of the Rings? Ultimately, I think it was a passion for the legends, a passion for history, a passion for culture. When you really love something, you write about it, you create, kind of like I am right now. Except, of course, when you're JRR Tolkien, you make it really, really long. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. JRR Tolkien is certainly a master of writing and world building. It's absolutely incredible when you think about it and when you analyze this stuff. Anyway, you can subscribe to this channel for more video essays and all that kind of stuff, and I will see you in the next video.